You might recall that we talked about how Luke was a writer who had never met Jesus. He writes a gospel from an outsider's perspective, a non-Jew for non-Jews, under the supervision of the Apostle Paul, which is, therefore, it's considered inspired. And the early church designated it as one of four gospels, four good news stories about Jesus. And after some introductory remarks, we come to the beginning of the real text, which is a reminder that for 400 years there has been complete silence from God. The last prophet Malachi had written his book about the year 432 BC, somewhere around there. So it's been over 400 years, and the Jewish people are waiting and waiting for what they hope will be the Messiah. Now, for the past 50 years, as this story begins, they've been under Roman occupation, and more than anything, they want to regain their independence. Some of the oldest people still remember when they were independent, and they yearn for it. Some of the younger ones are real firebrand radicals who will fight for it. And in this volatile mix, the story begins. It begins, first of all, with the coming of the Messiah, but you don't just plop the Messiah into the story. There needs to be an introduction, a hey, he's coming kind of segue. And whether you're talking about a king in the Middle Ages who would have a herald come and announce his coming, or if you're old enough to remember when the circus came to town 100 years ago, I know none of us can remember that, but before radio and television, they would send the advance team to paper barns and telephone poles and everything to say, hey, the circus is coming, be ready, get excited. And then if you go to a modern television show to see the taping, they'll have a warm-up comedian who will get you in the mood to begin to laugh. It's important that the mood gets set. And Luke's story begins with two miraculous births that should not, by human wisdom, be able to happen, which is what makes them only from God. The first one is the birth of the herald. And as we said a couple of weeks ago, we start with Luke 1 verse 5. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. And so Luke, the historian, places this in its context during the reign of Herod the Great, the client king of the Romans. Herod dies about the year we call 4 BC, and so ironically, Jesus, by the way, is going to be born BC. They didn't get the years exactly right when they were figuring them out. But Herod is the great king of Judea. He does a very good job for the Romans, keeping the people in line. If he has to knock a few heads, he will. And it's in the midst of that our story begins. It begins with a priest named Zechariah. Now, perhaps it was important that the herald come from a priestly family. There are probably biblical reasons why it should. But this priest is an elderly man, a man named Zechariah, who's married to also a descendant of the tribe of Levi. His wife is named Elizabeth. And he is in the priestly division of Abijah. Why is that important? As we said a couple of weeks ago, by the time you get to the New Testament, it's not like in the book of Exodus where there's Aaron and a couple of sons and a couple of grandsons. It's estimated in the New Testament there were around 24,000 priests. So how does everybody get a turn in a 365-day year? Well, they don't. And we'll talk about what they do instead. What they do is divide them up into groups of about 800, and twice a year for a 2-week period, your particular division, in this case the division of Abijah, will go and serve. Now, in this particular year, they're going to serve around the 1st of May and around this time in November. We'll be there 2 times a year, according to the year we think this was. Luke says that both of them, Zechariah and Elizabeth, were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly, but they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Childlessness was considered by many Jewish rabbis to be a sign of sin. So one of the things Jesus had to constantly battle against was their perception that their circumstances were a reflection of their spiritual condition before God. If you were poor, it was because there was sin in your life. If you were sick, there must be sin in your life. If you were in some sort of dire strait like childlessness, then there must be some sin you've got to root out in your life. But Luke makes it very clear there's no sin in these people's lives. They are righteous and blameless and upright. And he says they are very old. Well, how old is very old in New Testament times? I'm 63. That would have been very old in their time. I mean, they could have been mid-50s and still be considered very old in their circumstances. The stigma of childlessness. Many of the rabbis viewed childlessness as a curse from God. If you didn't have a child in a practical sense, and often you would have multiple children, you would have that safety net for your old age. They would be expected to take you in and to care for you in your declining years. And many of the rabbis taught that childlessness was a reason that you could get a divorce. And the fact that Zechariah did not divorce Elizabeth throughout their married life maybe speaks to the fact that he loved her and didn't want to put her away. I think that's a sweet thought. Now, the priest Zechariah was part of the division of Abijah, and we talk about how they were divided into divisions. When you went there with your 830 group of 830 for your 2 weeks, every day there will be 3 priests chosen to go into the inner sanctum of the temple, the holy place. The first priest will go in and take out the coals, the ashes from the altar of incense. The second priest will go in with the new coals, which he has to take from the altar of sacrifice in the courtyard, and he takes these hot coals and he puts them in the altar of incense. And the third priest, the one who has the really big daddy rabbit job, who's, that's important, and it was considered to be lucky to be chosen to go do this job, because you only got 365 of these guys a year that get to do it. And your chance of getting to do it in any year is 1.6%. It's a very, very small chance you'll get to do it. And it is estimated that many, many priests served a whole lifetime and never had the opportunity to serve in the holy place. And all they would do would be to drop the incense on the hot coals. That was their job. They also had the tradition that if you got chosen, that you were blessed by God, and you might even get rich because of it. So everybody was anxious for their turn to be in the holy place. And you can see here the different divisions divided up by their Jewish lunar calendar, and you see when Abijah served. The new year began for the Jews March 25th, thereabouts. So you see in Abijah, he's serving toward the end of April, 1st of March, and then again this time in November. What did a priest do? He did several things. First of all, he would work on the sacrifices that the people brought animals to sacrifice. That's what most of them did. One very lucky person a day would get to light the incense. They were the moral guardians of the people, or they were expected to be. Now, the priests were, by and large, of the political division of Sadducees, which don't have a great reputation in the New Testament, but they saw themselves as the guardian of the temple, and that they were, at least their leaders, high priests and people like that, would do whatever they needed to do in order to keep the temple going. And if that meant cooperating with the Romans, then that's what they would do. That's why the high priests had a really tough job. They would sometimes sacrifice one of their own, like Jesus, in order to preserve what they considered to be their trust as guardians of the temple. They also had other more minor responsibilities like medical diagnoses of skin diseases like leprosy, telling people when they had to be quarantined. Sometimes they would mediate disputes. But to serve in the temple was a great honor for a priest. And not everybody of the tribe of Levi was a priest. You had to be directly descended from Aaron. The rest of the Levites served in various capacities around the temple, mainly in custodial work, supply work, things like that. Luke continues, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. Now, Luke, being a non-Jew, writing to non-Jews, throws in the explanatory explanation that this is according to the Jewish custom. And he'll have a lot of explanatory explanations throughout his book because his readers aren't familiar with Jewish custom. Chosen by lot, literally winning the lottery. What a weird way to decide who gets to go in and light the incense. Well, the Jews believed very strongly in this verse. Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Casting lots was an important part of many ancient cultures. For the Jews, they had a long tradition of believing that whatever came up was the Lord's guidance. And probably it went back to the high priest in the Old Testament who wore what was called an ephod, and he had a stone in each of those things representing one of the tribes of Israel. And behind that breastplate, there were two stones, the Urim and the Thummim. Now, nobody knows exactly what they looked like or exactly how they were used, but the priest would apparently, the high priest, who was the guardian of these stones, would be asked sometimes by the king or other important government people, or maybe be just average people, I'm not sure, but ask an important yes or no question and would reach into his breastplate and pull out one of the stones. And that was considered to be the decision of God. Now, as modern people, we might not be real comfortable with that method, but they believed quite strongly and had been told by God to use this in some fashion like this in the Old Testament. In fact, in the New Testament, when Judas hanged himself, and a replacement was being decided in Acts chapter 1. It came down to two men who were qualified. They were qualified because they had been with Jesus the whole time during his public ministry, which was the qualification to even be considered to be an apostle, which, by the way, is why there are no more apostles. Nobody meets those qualifications. But when they decided, they did it the old-fashioned Jewish way. They cast the lot. And Matthias won the lottery. And it was decided he would become the 12th apostle. Now, why don't we decide who's going to be elder or preacher or maybe what songs Tim's going to sing? He just rolls 3 dice and whatever numbers come up, that's what we sing. Well, it's kind of an example without a command. There's never anywhere in the New Testament that tells us to do it this way. And I don't know. It just would be different to try to do it this way. That seems to be an Old Testament kind of way of thinking, I guess. Anyway, when we talk about Herod's temple, you have to remember how huge this complex was. It was approximately 4 times the size of an American football field. So this is huge. And it was, the temple, if you can imagine, is a series of concentric rings that restricts who can go to the next ring. It was all about God in the bullseye and who is there outside the ring. If you went to the temple, a lot of people would come through the eastern gate. That gate's blocked up today, by the way, because the Muslims believed in old Jewish tradition that the Messiah would come through the eastern gate, so it's all blocked up now, so nobody can get through it. But in this time, the eastern gate was an important entrance into the temple, and it would lead to the first ring, which was Solomon's porch. Solomon's porch is that portico area, not too unlike the sidewalk that you walked up here with the columns. And we learn from the book of Acts that the first Christians met within Solomon's porch there in the temple. As you go beyond the porch, you come to the court of the Gentiles. This is as far as a Gentile can go. That's his ring, his or her ring. And separating the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the inner rings was the Soreg wall, and on it were these signs, one of which was recovered by archaeologists, and it says, "No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow." The Romans did not allow the Jews to kill people. That's why they had to go to Pilate and ask, if they could maybe kill Jesus for him. This is the only exception to that I know of. They were allowed to kill Gentiles who went beyond the Soreg wall into the next ring. And what was the next ring? The next ring, going through the wall, is the court of women. And this is as far as the women were allowed to go. Now, ladies, I realize the rules are different in the Old Testament, but that was as far as they could go. It was a magnificent appearance, and in front of you was the Nicanor Gate, a huge bronze gate. It is said that it took 22 men to open it, and so they didn't close it a lot sometimes, but that was as far as you could go. But the men would go through the gate with their sacrifice, with the animals they had, a sheep, a goat, a bull, a dove, and they would enter the temple of the men, the court of the men. And they could go as far as the next ring, which is you could not go into where the priests were. You can see the priests are accepting the animals and they are sacrificing them on a more or less constant basis throughout the hours from about 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. 9 a.m. was the morning prayer, and 3 p.m. was the evening prayer, and this would go on all day. Now, it says that Zechariah was chosen by lot to go into the temple and burn incense. And what that meant was, although this next ring of priests could serve at the altar, sacrificing the animals, some of them would be at the Sea of Bronze, which is just a humongous big thing of water where the priests would wash, or the animals would be washed, the parts of them. It was in order to keep it clean. But to enter the holy place, that was the next ring, and that was the one that only those three priests, the one who took out the ash, the one who brought in the coals, and most importantly, the one who came in to light the incense, they were the only ones allowed in there. The final ring, which would only be entered once a year, was the most holy place. Now, in Solomon's temple, the most holy place had included the Ark of the Covenant, which upon it had two cherubim, two angel-looking things that were considered to be the mercy seat, and that is where the high priest would enter once a year to sacrifice for the sins of the people. He would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. So that would only ever be seen by the priest. Now, in the time of Jesus, there was nothing in the most holy place. It was empty. But it was behind a curtain, and it was still considered the place that the high priest would commune with God. And so, if you imagine the temple as this series of concentric rings, Zechariah has the opportunity to go into the holy place. And it will look something like this. It was truly magnificent, burnished in gold and bronze. The priests that came in to take out the coals or to bring in the new coals would make sure that those candles stayed lit. And Zechariah would, or whoever's turn it was, would approach the altar of incense. Now, as they approached, it wouldn't be lit like that with the smoke coming up. It would just be the hot coals on it. Because at 3 o'clock, the evening prayer, something special would happen. Out in the courtyard, the priests would raise their hands and everybody would go quiet. And that was the signal for the start of the prayer. and there would be some signal, a bell, a trumpet, nobody's quite sure, but the priest inside would hear the sound and know it was time to drop the incense on the incense altar, and that smoke would go up, and it was considered to be a sweet smell to God. And so at the same time that the hundreds of men in the courtyard were praying, their prayers going up to God, the incense is going up to God. It was all a very wonderful ceremony. And if the wind was blowing just the right way, you could smell the incense coming out of the temple. The incense was made by the Antipas family, a secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices. Now you laugh, but it was 11 herbs and spices. Not the kernels, it was a different kind. The Bible only mentions 4 of the ingredients, one of which is frankincense, which is the gum resin of a tree in Arabia. Hard to get, that's why it was expensive. And you can go to Google and it will tell you what all 11 ingredients were, maybe. But anyway, that was what Zechariah was supposed to do. Get the incense from the Antipas representative and go into the temple, and when the bell or the trumpet sounded at 3 p.m., drop the incense, and there comes the incense up to God. It says, when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. That was the ceremony. It was very impressive. Hold up your hands. Everybody quiet. We pray. And the incense goes up. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. Ain't nobody supposed to be in there except him. And here is a person, apparently, who appears. Now, artist projections of what an angel looks like are the artist's imagination. Does the angel have wings? I don't know. The Greek word angel just means messenger. He's a messenger from God. Now, this is an important messenger, as we'll see, but how he looked, and, I don't know, gender is even a part of it here. This is a messenger from God that startles Zechariah, and he is gripped with fear. Now, most people, particularly those outside the church, think of cuddly little baby-like angels with wings. Aren't they sweet? And yet, I'm hard-pressed to think of a single time in the New Testament where they don't scare somebody to death. Every time they appear, they scare people. I don't know what's scary about them other than maybe their sudden appearance or maybe the way they appear. But the shepherds are terrified when the angels appear to them. The guards around Jesus' tomb are absolutely terrified. The angel that will appear to Mary will say what they all seem to say when they're appearing for a good purpose: do not be afraid, because they know that is the standard reaction to an angel. So whatever you think of angels, and I don't know a whole lot about them, they weren't cuddly babies. They weren't cherubs. And so this angel appears to Zechariah and has a message. The angel said to him, the standard greeting, first words out of his mouth, do not be afraid. I need you to sit up and pay attention, Zechariah. I don't need you quivering and wondering about, am I going to smite you down? Listen to me. Your prayer has been heard. Zechariah, you've been praying your whole life. Now, at your age, you may have stopped praying a prayer for a child a long time ago. I don't know. But your prayer, whenever they were prayed, constantly when you were younger, less so in your older age, your prayer has been heard and now will be answered. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, not just a child, but a son. And for cultures like that, a son is very important because daughters, precious as they are given away to another family. But a son is taking care of you. And you are to call him John. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But the angel tells Zechariah what he is to name his son. That's unusual in and of itself. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. And then we got the little clause here, but he is never to take wine or other fermented drink. Well, that's interesting, because that harkens back to something that only happened a couple of times in the Old Testament. Two men, Samson and Samuel, and we'll talk about more about that. But why is this particular thing important? How do I explain? If you lived in ancient times, what would you drink on a daily basis? Now, you might think, well, water. Okay. If you have a well that you trust, good. Otherwise, water is kind of sketchy. And so most people would drink a little wine. They would cut the wine with water. Wine would be used to essentially kill the germs and make the water safe to drink. But this boy is not going to be able to do that. Okay, then I guess he has to drink milk. Well, you don't have a refrigerator, so unless you carry a goat with you wherever you go, you don't have milk to drink. You're going to in order for you to drink water your whole life, which is basically what this boy is going to be called upon to do, it requires at this time an element of faith. The fact that in America there's such a strong element of teetotaling is because in America, when our ancestors arrived, the water was all clean. They had no need, in many cases, for alcoholic drinks to be safe. They had plenty of safe water to drink. Anyway, there's a lot of historical reasons to go back, but he is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. Now, in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit would come upon a person in very rare circumstances and only for very brief times. And this young man, before he's even born, will have the Holy Spirit within him. When Peter gets up in the book of Acts at Pentecost and says, "Be baptized and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit," to a modern person, that's just so many words. But to them, to get what the prophets had, to get what a part of God in your life, no wonder 3,000 men line up and be baptized that morning, because that is a wonderful, marvelous blessing given to very, very few till that time. And then Gabriel, or the angel, says this: he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. He will be similar to the greatest prophet in your history. Elijah was considered to be the greatest of all the prophets, and he will be like that man. And this is his purpose: to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready as a herald a people prepared for the Lord. Now, Zechariah is told to name his son Yochanan, which is the Hebrew equivalent of the English word John. And that means God is gracious. This is what you're to name your son: God is gracious. And he is to have what for the Israelites was called the Nazirite vow. Now, if you were a Jew in the Old Testament and into the New Testament, the Apostle Paul certainly takes this vow. You would, if you had an especially stressful time in your life or an especially important decision, or if you just wanted to be especially close to God, you would take a Nazirite vow. You would say before God, "I promise not to take any fermented drink, not to cut my hair, not to touch any dead bodies or be around people at funerals." And most commonly, this vow would be for 30 days. But this young man like Samson and like Samuel, will be a Nazirite for life. For life. Now, I have a 10-year-old grandson. I'm trying to imagine what he would look like if I had never had his hair cut for 10 years. Can you imagine at 30 how you look if you never cut your beard or trim your hair? I mean, I've seen ladies with hair way down, but having a Nazirite vow for 30 days, not getting a haircut for a month, men can understand that. And you would cut your head, often you would shave it, and then the hair would be sacrificed on the altar to God. 30 days, no big deal. But a lifetime, you're going to stand out. You are going to look odd. And maybe that was the point. He was supposed to look different. I mean, this is mild compared to what he would have looked like. John the Baptist would have been something to see. But the angel said to him, among other things, he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. And in that moment, Zechariah, a priest familiar with the Old Testament, I think his jaw would drop because he knows that the angel is quoting the very last words of the Old Testament. The 400 years of silence is over, and the prophet like Elijah is coming. And the angel only gives kind of the first part of the prophecy, which is that he will turn the hearts of the parents to their children. And I guess the second part is left unstated, but Zechariah knows it. Else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. So this boy that he will be the father of will have the job of being like Elijah. He will stand out. Buddy, will he stand out? And he will either convince the people of the person coming and change their hearts, or the land will be destroyed. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this?" Now, that's a perfectly understandable question. But when you are talking to someone who has appeared miraculously and begun to talk as this person is talking, skepticism is not the appropriate response. Now, it's understandable, but his doubt is not appropriate in the situation. This leader, this priest of Israel, is like, come on, seriously, how can I be sure that this will happen? I'm an old man and my wife is well along in years. Now, that's certainly true. What the angel is saying will happen is impossible in his mind. So I can understand his skepticism. The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel." And again, that's going to ring bells in Zechariah's mind because Gabriel has only appeared once before to the prophet Daniel. And Gabriel had given a lot of prophecies to the prophet Daniel. And this is Gabriel. If this is Gabriel, Daniel, Zechariah, that's a short list. He's received the messenger from God. Gabriel says, "I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news which you apparently do not believe. And now, because you don't believe it, you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Gabriel means God is great. And as we said, he appears in the book of Daniel and then to Zechariah and then to Mary. And he's one of only two angels who gives a name in the Bible, the other one being Michael. In the Middle Ages, people became fascinated with angels. It was kind of a mania. And Gabriel gets a lot of additional things added to him. When Paul talks about in Thessalonians how the trumpet will sound on the day of judgment, they ascribe that to Gabriel. That's not in the Bible, but Gabriel becomes the trumpet blower. and he is made into an archangel, which, again, is not in the Bible. But Gabriel is the messenger from God. This is an awesome thing, to be in the presence of Gabriel. Why does he render Zechariah speechless? Well, number one, to silence his unbelief. You know, it probably would not be a good thing for Zechariah to go home to Elizabeth and say, look, I don't believe that this is going to happen, but we kind of got to do this anyway. I'm not going to put too fine a point on it, but I think you get my meaning. And for him to express skepticism any further than he already has would not be a good thing. And so he's rendered silent. On the other hand, it keeps him from bragging. I'm about to become the father of the next Elijah, which you people better listen to or you're all going to be destroyed. No, we'll put a stop to that too. This will be kind of a quiet 9 months. And lastly, to give him a sign of remembrance and promise. You don't believe you're going to have this happen? All right, you don't get to speak until it happens. And every time you try to speak, it'll remind you that this is going to happen. And I can only imagine how the next 9 months go for him, trying to explain to Elizabeth. Clearly there's some communication that goes on, as we'll see later, between he and his wife in written form. But she has a husband that doesn't say anything for 9 months. Many ladies would see that as a positive. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. What he was supposed to do is to drop in the incense, it goes up to God, and then you come out and you say on the steps before the people, before the men that are assembled there, the great blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face toward you and give you peace. And that's said in every synagogue to this day. And that was his job, except he's not doing his job. He's not coming out. And that makes people nervous. What do we do? Do we just wait here till nightfall? Do we draw another lot and send in another priest to go rescue this guy? What do we do? It's always funny when things go wrong at church. In my lifetime, when I turned 13, when I was baptized when I was 13, Al Harley, who was a deacon here for 50 years or more, in charge of getting men to pass out the communion back before COVID. You remember how you passed out the communion? He came and grabbed me the week after I was baptized and said, all right, you're going to pass out communion with the other guys. And I remember one of the first times I did that, I started at the first row right here, a lady I'd never seen before. She looked up at me, she smiled, she grabbed the bread, popped the whole thing in her mouth, and I'm left with an empty tray. And I have to put my head down and go back to the back and get more bread from Al. I remember another time I'm sitting in a row here, and you know how people are. They don't sit real close, and you have the choice. You either stand up and go bring it down and hand it to them, or, you know, if you're young and cocky like I am at 13 or 14, you kind of lean and hand it, except I leaned a little too fast, and that doily and that bread went 3 rows back like a Frisbee, hit a lady right in the head and hit the ground. One other time I remember the men, at least back at McGregor Boulevard, would come up and they would, the communion would be on the table and the men would be spread out in a phalanx. Al was an old military man, and so you spread the men out in a phalanx and they would go do their different things, and then you would pass the trays out. And there was one man over here who, I don't know if he was sleepy, wasn't paying attention, but his tray kind of dropped and the doily and the bread slopped to the floor. And you knew what every man in there was thinking. All right, 5-second rule, pick it up, blow on it. Come on, let's get this thing going. And every woman was saying, don't you dare pick that. That's nasty. We're not going to do that. And he eventually went back and got it. But the all-time best one, Randy told me about, happened at a church in Tennessee where toward the end of service, a very distinguished elderly man named Mr. Peabody was going to come lead the closing prayer. And the equally distinguished song leader got up and said, all right, let's bow our heads. Mr. Peabody will come and pee for us. And And everybody burst out laughing and could not stop laughing, and Mr. Peabody was not coming up to lead a prayer. And so for one of the few times in church history, they just left because nobody was going to get anything done. So when worship doesn't go the way it's supposed to go, what do? Well, eventually, Zechariah comes out, and we'll talk about what happens next the next time I'm in here.